I learned about the trip on a quiet afternoon that started like any other. The sun was slipping through the curtains in soft lines, and I was drinking my coffee while scrolling through messages. Nothing unusual appeared at first, only pictures from friends and reminders from the bank. Then a notification popped up from a group chat my brother had created months earlier. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another joke or a random family update. Instead, I opened it and saw plans that did not include me at all. He had organized a luxurious weekend trip to Paris, filled with reservations that sounded extravagant even by his standards. The list felt endless. Fine restaurants, a private car waiting near Charles de Gaulle, a visit to an art gallery. I stared at the screen while a cold heaviness settled at the base of my neck. They were leaving the next morning. I tried to convince myself that this had to be a misunderstanding. I looked for my name. I searched again, hoping that maybe the messages were incomplete or missing some part. The more I scrolled, the clearer it became that everyone knew about this except me. My parents were already excited. My brother had confirmed their seats and talked about the hotel like he was describing a kingdom reserved for the chosen ones. I tried to breathe slowly, but my chest tightened anyway. It felt like waking up to find a room full of open doors while being told that none of them were meant for you. I called my mother. She answered with a calm tone that sounded almost rehearsed. When I asked about the trip, she paused long enough for me to understand that she had expected my question. She explained that it was a family-only weekend. I stayed silent for a moment, trying to understand how that sentence was supposed to include everyone except me. She continued in the same calm voice, insisting that it was a simple gathering for the closest circle. I remembered the countless times I helped them, the bills I covered when no one else could, the moments they called me during emergencies, and the birthday dinners where I was the one who paid because my parents never carried cash anymore. None of that mattered at that moment, because they had already decided I was not part of what they considered family. After hanging up, I stood in the living room holding my phone as if I needed proof that it had happened. I walked from one corner to the other trying to understand the logic behind their decision. It made no sense. I had supported my parents for years. I had been the one who kept peace during arguments. I had been the one who stayed close when my father had surgery. I had been the one who helped my brother graduate when he struggled during his final year. It was strange how quickly years of effort could be erased by a single afternoon. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the kitchen, wiping the counter, and folding the towels. Everything felt mechanical. My mind kept going back to their voices. My parents had always been selective with affection, but this was different. This felt intentional. It felt like being placed behind an invisible line that everyone else pretended not to see. I remembered childhood moments when I was told to adjust myself for the sake of harmony, to be patient, to understand, to forgive. Those words came back with a sting. Perhaps I had been trained to accept exclusion without questioning it. As the day continued, I expected someone to call and correct the situation. No call came. The house felt too quiet. Every sound echoed with a faint reminder that I had been removed from something that was supposed to include me. I sat on the couch in the late afternoon, trying to focus on a show I had already watched several times. Nothing could settle my mind. The idea of my family preparing for a weekend in Paris without bothering to tell me gnawed at me like a slow, persistent ache. I went outside to clear my thoughts. The air was cold but refreshing. I watched people passing by, some laughing, some rushing, others walking with no particular intention. It struck me that none of them knew what I was going through. They did not know what it felt like to see people you love treat you like an afterthought. I walked around the block twice before returning home. The house felt even colder than the street. Evening approached, and I tried once more to convince myself that someone would call. I turned off the lights in the living room and sat in the dim glow of the lamp near the window. I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. A part of me understood that this moment did not appear out of nowhere. It came from years of being treated as convenient rather than important. It came from habits that had turned into expectations and expectations that had turned into entitlement. Yet this time it pierced deeper because it revealed the truth without disguise. I stared at the screen long enough for my coffee to grow cold. My first thought was that someone had stolen my card information. That seemed like the only reasonable explanation. I felt a wave of confusion stronger than the shock, a sense that the ground beneath me had shifted without warning. I opened the details of one charge. It clearly showed the airline. It showed the departure city. It showed the exact time they checked in. It showed their names. That was when the confusion changed into something heavier. It felt like a door I had closed the day before was suddenly kicked open with force. They used my card. My own family, who had excluded me from a trip they called family only, had used my money so they could enjoy the luxury they believed I owed them. I stared at the screen while my heart sank into a place I had not visited in years. It was not sadness. It was not anger either. It was something deeper, something that felt like betrayal wrapped in cold clarity. I remained seated for several minutes, studying the numbers as if they could rearrange themselves into something less brutal. The flight information alone would have been enough to create a storm inside me. The hotel suite confirmed the intention. The wine bill sealed the truth in a way that felt almost cruel. They had dismissed me with ease. But my card was welcome. My efforts were welcome. My silence was expected. My presence was unnecessary. My wallet, however, had a seat on the plane. I finally stood up and paced through the living room, trying to find oxygen in a room that felt suddenly too small. I pressed my hands against my forehead, hoping the pressure would calm the rising storm in my chest. I scrolled again, hoping the numbers would disappear, that maybe I had misread something, that maybe this was a dream created by exhaustion. The numbers did not fade. They remained in bright digital ink, permanent and unforgiving. They used my card. I sat down again and opened the call log. I tried to contact my brother first. His phone rang without answer. I tried again. Nothing. I called my father. The call disconnected without ringing. I called my mother. Her phone was switched off. I stared at the screen, realizing that every path toward communication had been intentionally blocked. They were already in the air or already settling into their Paris suite, enjoying a vacation financed by the daughter they left behind. A quiet realization spread through me. They had excluded me on purpose. They had chosen to enjoy a weekend of comfort while making sure I stayed far away from it. And they had done it while expecting me to pay. It felt like being erased and used at the same time. I remained still, letting the truth sink into every corner of my thoughts. I stood up and filled a glass of water, but my hand trembled so much that a few drops spilled on the counter. I placed the glass down and leaned on the edge of the sink. The house felt different now. Everything inside it seemed to shift and sharpen. The betrayal carried a taste I could not describe, a bitterness that stayed on the tongue even without speaking a single word. I walked through each room as if I were seeing them for the first time. The framed pictures on the wall, the souvenirs from past trips, the old photographs where I had a place beside them. Now I looked at those images with new eyes. I saw a version of myself that had always made room for others, always stepped aside to help, always offered more than she received. That version of me had covered the bills. That version had solved the emergencies. That version had believed that loyalty would one day return to her. Yet the weekend trip revealed a different truth. My phone buzzed again. Another charge appeared. The restaurant bill. Another meal. Another amount I had never authorized. I felt my stomach twist. They were still spending. They were using my card while I stood alone in my kitchen. I sank into the nearest chair, allowing myself a moment to breathe. The betrayal was not a single act. It was a sequence of decisions that carried no hesitation. They had planned the trip, purchased the tickets, booked the suite, ordered the drinks, and walked through Paris with the confidence of people who believed they deserved everything without giving anything in return. I realized then that if I remained silent, the spending would continue. The charges would grow until they returned home, satisfied and careless, believing everything was normal. I understood what needed to be done. I reached for my phone with a calmness that surprised me. I opened the banking application once more. I examined each line, each amount, each date, each location. I memorized them with a precision I never expected to possess. I pressed the number of the bank. The automated voice greeted me, but my focus remained sharp. I waited for the representative. When the call connected, I explained everything in clear detail. I told them the card had been used without authorization. I stated that I did not make those purchases. I confirmed that I did not approve those charges. I listened as the bank agent reviewed the transactions. Each confirmation felt like a step toward reclaiming something I had lost, something that had evaporated during years of allowing others to define my worth. The bank took immediate action. They froze the card. They initiated a review. They reversed the charges. I listened carefully as each step unfolded. My heart beat slowly but steadily. When the call ended, the house felt lighter. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer controlled the direction of my thoughts. I walked to the window and looked outside. The world continued moving. Cars drove past. People walked with purpose. Life went on. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time the notifications read reversed. Cancelled. Declined. Blocked. Every luxury they enjoyed in Paris began to crumble beneath them. I imagined them trying to pay for something and discovering that the card no longer worked. I imagined their confusion. I imagined their frustration. And I felt no guilt. I placed the phone on the table and allowed myself a small breath of relief. It was not revenge. It was justice. It was balance returning to a world that had tilted against me for far too long. I knew they would call again. I knew they would try to reach me once they realized what had happened. I also knew that I would not answer. Not yet. Not this time. For years, they had expected me to accept everything without raising my voice. On that day, I finally chose myself. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the weight lifting, slowly but unmistakably. I opened them again and looked around the room. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The betrayal was now complete. But so was the awakening. I did not expect calmness to be the first thing I felt. After the shock of the betrayal, after the weight that settled on my chest when I saw the charges, after the silence that followed my unanswered calls, I thought I would crumble. Instead, a strange clarity rose inside me like a tide that refused to turn back. I sat with my phone in my hand and breathed slowly until my heartbeat found a steady rhythm. I realized I had a choice. Either I continued carrying the burden they placed on me, or I placed it exactly where it belonged. I chose the second path. I opened the banking application again and looked at each transaction. Every amount stared at me like a reminder of what they thought I would tolerate. I memorized the timeline. I counted the purchases. I examined the restaurant bills, the suite charges, the wine totals, and the late-night notifications showing new activities that continued while I stood alone in my home. Their enjoyment had not paused for a moment. They were eating, drinking, walking through Paris, and buying small luxuries with a confidence that grew with each silent hour. I pressed the call button for the bank and waited. The voice that answered sounded distant at first, because my mind was still walking through the scenes I imagined in Paris. My parents checking in at the hotel. My brother ordering appetizers. My mother choosing wine. My father lounging in a suite I had unknowingly paid for. I forced my attention back to the present and explained everything from the beginning. My voice stayed steady. I found no anger in it, only precision. The representative listened with patience. I detailed each charge. I confirmed that the card had not been used with my consent. I described my absence from the trip. I explained that I had no knowledge of their purchases and no involvement in the transactions. The representative assured me that immediate steps would be taken. I heard the clicking of keys. The investigation began within seconds. The card was frozen. The transactions were flagged. Reversal procedures were initiated. The call ended with a confirmation that everything was now in process. I placed the phone on the table and looked around the room. Something about the silence felt new. It was not empty. It was not heavy. It was a quiet that came from taking a step I should have taken long ago. I stood still, letting the room hold that feeling. My eyes drifted toward the window. The sky had the pale color of morning that always appears before the world becomes busy. I felt like I was looking at my life from a different angle, one where my worth no longer depended on their approval. A few minutes later, the first notification arrived. Reversal initiated. I stared at the words with a sense of disbelief that slowly shifted into relief. Then another notification appeared showing a cancellation. Then another showing a decline. Then a fourth showing a blocked amount. Each alert felt like a small stone being lifted from my shoulders. I stood beside the window, listening to the quiet chime of each update as if the house itself were celebrating the shift. I imagined their reactions unfolding in real time. I pictured them at the hotel reception, trying to pay for something and seeing a message appear on the screen. I pictured the confusion on my father's face. I pictured my mother searching through her purse for another card she rarely used. I pictured my brother checking the app for the card he believed he controlled. I pictured their shock growing each time the payment failed. I walked to the kitchen and made myself another cup of coffee. The warmth of the mug rested in my hands while the phone continued buzzing. Cancellations kept appearing one after another, creating a steady rhythm that felt almost therapeutic. I took a sip and let the bitterness of the coffee settle on my tongue. It felt grounding. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost under years of habitual sacrifice. Eventually, the calls started. The first one came from my brother. I recognized the ringtone immediately. I placed the phone on the counter and allowed it to vibrate until it stopped. A few seconds later, another call arrived. This time from my mother. Then from my father. Then again from my brother. The sequence repeated without pause. My phone rang as if the entire city of Paris had suddenly turned toward me and demanded an explanation. I let every call pass. My silence was not an act of cruelty. It was a boundary. A long overdue one. I sat at the kitchen table as the calls continued. The vibrations ran across the surface like a restless insect. I did not move to pick it up. I leaned back in the chair and allowed myself to think clearly for the first time in days. I thought about the pattern of my life with them. I thought about the years of being responsible while they drifted through life without understanding the value of gratitude. I thought about the difference between helping out of love and being used out of convenience. Another series of notifications appeared. Hotel payment declined. Additional charges blocked. Fraud investigation active. The reversal continued. I imagined the hotel staff standing near them with polite expressions hiding confusion. I imagined my family whispering among themselves, wondering what went wrong. I imagined the moment they realized the card no longer worked because the person they excluded was the same person who held the financial key. Outside, the morning continued to unfold. Cars passed on the street. Birds settled on branches. The world kept its rhythm. I stayed still in the calmness that came from knowing I had taken back control. The calls eventually slowed down, then paused. The quiet felt heavier than before. It felt like the silence that follows a storm when people stand among the ruins trying to understand what happened. I walked to the living room and sat on the couch. I picked up one of the books from the table, opened it, and pretended to read. My mind drifted again. I pictured my mother calling the card company through the hotel phone. I pictured my father arguing with the staff. I pictured my brother looking at the bill with disbelief. They had been so certain of their comfort that they never imagined a scenario where their plans would collapse. Additional notifications arrived in quick succession. Final reversal approved. Fraud review expanded. Card permanently blocked. I closed my eyes and let a slow breath leave my chest. The process was complete. I had done what needed to be done. The consequences would unfold on their own. I returned to the kitchen and washed the mug. The simple sound of water running felt cleansing. I placed the mug on the rack and listened to the quiet around me. I felt no guilt. The betrayal had been intentional. My response had been necessary. My family had built a tower of entitlement that now stood exposed. Hours passed without another call. I thought they might have found a way to settle part of the bill. I also knew they were not enjoying the trip anymore. The luxury they planned had turned into inconvenience. Their excitement had turned into discomfort. Their expectations had turned into disappointment. I wondered if they had realized that the person they dismissed had been holding everything together without recognition. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the house. I swept the floor. I organized the cabinet. I folded laundry. Each task felt strangely meaningful, as if reclaiming physical space helped reclaim emotional space. Occasionally, the phone would buzz with another update from the bank confirming steps taken in the investigation. Each message strengthened the growing sense of balance. Late in the evening, the calls resumed. This time they came with a slower rhythm, carrying a heaviness that hinted at exhaustion. I watched the screen light up, then fade, then light up again. I did not answer. I understood that any conversation that day would not bring understanding or change. Anger would speak first. Accusations would follow. Blame would rise. None of it would bring clarity. None of it would repair years of imbalance. I walked to the window as the sun began to set. The sky carried a soft blend of colors. I watched the shift and felt a quiet acceptance rise within me. This reversal was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming a sense of self that had been lost under years of being the responsible one. It was about taking a step that should have been taken long ago. Night settled slowly. The phone remained silent. The house felt still. I knew the next days would be filled with questions, confrontation, and explanations they were not prepared to hear. But at that moment, I felt something new. I felt strength. I felt distance. I felt clarity. For the first time in my life, their comfort was no longer my responsibility, and my silence became the loudest truth they ever heard. They arrived at my doorstep in the early evening, carrying the weight of a trip that had begun with excitement and ended with confusion, humiliation, and a silence none of them knew how to break. I had been expecting them, not because they warned me they were coming, but because guilt has a way of guiding people straight to the source of their discomfort. When I opened the door, the three of them stood there with an expression so tangled between anger and embarrassment that I could almost sense the arguments they had rehearsed on the drive back. Yet none of those arguments found a voice. They walked inside quietly as if entering a place they no longer recognized. The living room felt different with them sitting across from me. My brother slumped into the couch with the stiffness of someone who had spent days in discomfort. My mother sat upright, clutching her purse like a shield. My father stared at the floor as if waiting for someone else to speak first. I took a seat opposite them, letting the silence stretch far enough for them to understand that I was no longer stepping forward to ease tension. For years, I had filled silence with explanations and reassurances. This time, I let the quiet reveal everything they wished to avoid. I began by addressing the exclusion. I told them what it felt like to discover a trip I was never meant to know about, a trip planned under the excuse of family only while I was treated as if I had no rightful place. I explained how it felt to realize that the people who shared my history and my home had chosen a moment of joy without considering the presence of someone who had stood by them during every difficult chapter of their lives. Their eyes remained fixed on the floor, unable to confront the truth they helped create. Then I moved to the part they could not deny. I spoke about the financial betrayal. I described how the notifications appeared on my phone, one after another, revealing the charges they had made with my card. I explained the shock of seeing 3 first-class tickets, a luxury suite, lavish meals, and a wine bill that exceeded what I spend in an entire month. I described the moment I realized that while I had been excluded from their plans, my money had been included without hesitation. The room became still. My brother pressed his hands together with growing discomfort. My mother shifted in her seat as if trying to escape the truth circling around her. My father remained quiet, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. I continued with the part they had not anticipated. I described how I contacted the bank, how I explained each charge, how I walked through every detail with the representative. I described the calmness that came over me, a calmness I had not felt in years, a calmness that arrived when I finally acted for myself instead of bending for them. I explained how the reversal started, how each cancellation appeared on my phone like a quiet declaration of independence, how every blocked payment restored a piece of the balance that had been missing for so long. I watched their expressions change as I painted the image of their stay in Paris collapsing around them. I told them how I imagined the moment the hotel staff informed them that the card had been declined. I told them how I pictured their confusion, their frustration, their indignation, and their scramble to make sense of a situation they believed they controlled completely. I could see the memory flicker through their faces as they relived the discomfort. My mother touched her forehead. My father let out a slow breath. My brother lowered his gaze even more. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth carried its own weight. Each sentence I spoke was not revenge but revelation. Years of small slights, years of being overlooked, years of carrying responsibilities without acknowledgement, years of being treated like an extension of their comfort instead of a member of their family all rose to the surface in that room. I told them how deeply it hurt to be sidelined and used at the same time. I told them how long I had pretended not to notice the pattern. I told them how the trip to Paris had become the moment I could no longer ignore what had been true all along. They remained silent. The silence did not come from shock. It came from recognition. They had no defense for their choices. They had no justification for their entitlement. They had no explanation that could soften what they had done. My brother finally raised his eyes. They were not filled with anger. They were filled with regret he did not know how to express. My mother wiped the corner of her eye with a trembling hand. My father looked at me with the expression of a man realizing that the foundation he believed was solid had been crumbling for years. I ended by telling them something I had never said before. I told them that I was done being invisible. I told them that I would no longer accept being treated as an afterthought. I told them that I would no longer carry a burden they were unwilling to share. I told them that from that day forward, I expected respect, consideration, and effort equal to what I had given them for years. I told them that my silence was no longer available for their convenience. The room settled into a stillness that felt almost sacred. No one interrupted. No one attempted to soften my words. No one tried to rewrite the story in their favor. They knew they could not. My brother leaned back with a slow exhale and stared at the wall. My mother held her purse tightly as if grounding herself. My father rested his hands on his knees and nodded slightly in a gesture that felt closer to acceptance than surrender. We sat in that silence for a long time. It was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. They finally understood that the person who had always stood quietly in the background had stepped into her own life with a voice they never expected to hear. They understood that the balance of our relationship had shifted and would not return to its previous shape. They understood that I had outgrown the role they kept placing me in. When they stood to leave, none of them spoke. They walked to the door with slow steps, carrying the weight of everything they had heard. My mother paused for a moment, looking at me with eyes that carried both apology and uncertainty. My father placed his hand on the doorframe as if he needed support. My brother walked out first, his shoulders heavy with the realization that the ease of taking from me had ended. I watched them walk to their car. They did not turn back. I did not call after them. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, letting the silence return. The house felt lighter than it had in a long time. Not because they were gone, but because I had finally spoken my truth without hesitation. I walked to the living room and sat down. The quiet wrapped around me with a softness I had never felt before. I looked at my hands resting on my lap and realized they were steady. My breath was steady. My mind was steady. Something inside me had shifted permanently. Something that had been waiting for years to rise had finally stood tall. I expected sadness to come. I expected anger. I expected resentment. None of them appeared. Instead, I felt a calmness that settled into my chest like a long-awaited visitor. I felt a sense of strength that came from choosing myself. And beneath all of that, I felt something I had never associated with my family before. Peace. A peace born from clarity. A peace born from boundaries. A peace born from finally understanding my worth. A peace that filled the room and stayed with me long after their footsteps faded. A peace I had needed all my life.